Salutations, people! Welcome to Page 3 Killers, Murders That Went Unnoticed, a podcast where we dive into the murder cases that went unnoticed by our nation's newspapers. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Page 3 Killers, Murders That Went Unnoticed, Season 3, Episode 4, LA's Southside Slayer, Unmasked. Part 1 of 3. This week, we have the start of a huge 3-part episode for you folks. Why so long? Because we have so many killers who were all called the Southside Slayer. No less than 6 men were eventually linked to the killings. This week, we will be focusing on Louis Craine and Ivan Hill. As you will have noticed, John is not here for this week's episode. After the stress of the last few months, John has decided to take a step back from the podcast to pursue other opportunities. Now, from the start, this podcast has been my brainchild and focused on something I enjoyed. Now, true crime for me is an interesting topic that, unfortunately, right now, John does not have much interest in. I thought a lot about how this will affect the show going forward and how I can use this to make the show better. This week is the first step down that road. It is going to be a bumpy transition, and I hope you choose to continue the journey with me. Now more than ever, I would love to hear from each and every one of you out there listening about what cases you want to hear on the show. Right now, I have some great content planned for you all over the next few weeks, and I look forward to continuing to bring you this podcast each and every week. All right, guys, now that that's out of the way, I'd like to take a moment and thank our patrons on Patreon. Thank you guys so much for sticking it out with us and tuning in every week and being a part of our true crime community here at Page 3 Killers. Huge shout out to Stacey Fragale, Chelsea Hargrett, and Christy Bryson. Thank you guys so much for your donations on Patreon. It's truly appreciated. Now, if you guys out there want to help support the podcast, not just with content ideas, likes, or shares, you guys can always make a donation on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. You can, be a part of keeping our podcast going. And remember that you can always feel free to like, share, subscribe, which is free. All right, now let's get the ball rolling on this show. This week we are going to be talking about the LA's Southside Slayer. Now, the Southside Slayer was a name given by the police and the media to a killer they assumed was a single person, a single male, I should say, that they thought was responsible for the killing of up to 100 women in the Los Angeles area between the 1980s and 1990s. Now, many of these women whose lives were taken lived very tragic lives. Many of these women were either addicted to drugs or moonlighting at that time as prostitutes. I would like to take a moment to remind everyone that just because these women led hard lives did not mean that they deserved the end they received. Each was a mother, a sister, a daughter, an aunt, with a family that mourned their loss. With that said, we are looking at a very broad timeline with many murders being attributed to a single person. A person who the community and the city at large believed was allowed to run rampant by the Los Angeles Police Department. As I researched this case, I found some very interesting information, leading me, like many, to believe that the Southside Slayer's murders were not just perpetrated by one person alone, but by several working separately from one another. 6 men have been posed as the perpetrators of dozens of these murders. It is also clear that the similarities between many of the deaths attributed to the Southside Slayer were simply coincidental. In this 3-part series, I hope to begin unmasking the 6 men responsible for these horrible deaths. As I said earlier, we are going to talk about 2 of our 6 killers this week. We are going to focus on Louis Craine and Ivan Hill. The first perpetrator that we will be discussing is Louis Craine. Now, Louis Craine was active between 1985 and 1987, and his case is the most controversial out of all 6. And when I say controversial, I mean to refer to the controversy surrounding his guilt at the time of his conviction. Now, just before his conviction, Louis was diagnosed with intellectual disabilities, which we will later discuss in this episode. Louis was born on January 6th of 1957 in St. Louis. He was the 3rd of 4 children born to his parents. In his early school years, he indeed did show signs of intellectual disabilities and left school after the 4th grade. Not much is known of the years between then and the 1970s. But at some point in the early 1970s, he left his parents' home and became a vagrant. Now, due to his lack of education, he was unable to obtain a job that required qualifications. So Louis was forced to engage in low-skilled labor jobs over the next several years. For the years that he was employed, he changed jobs several times in the construction industry. And at the time of his arrest in 1987, he was unemployed. By May 29th of 1987, Louis was arrested on charges of killing a 29-year-old prostitute named Carolyn Barney. Carolyn had been raped and sodomized before being strangled, and her body was left in a vacant house. Sadly, the empty house in which her corpse was found was not far from his own family's home. After the body had been found and police called to the area, the police began to cordon off the scene when they noticed a strange man lurking nearby watching them. Now, we all know that it's not uncommon for people to gather at crime scenes, especially those of a terrible nature, but officers indicated that this man was behaving in a very inappropriate manner, a manner not common for onlookers and rubberneckers at crime scenes. At the scene, he was arrested and taken into police custody. After several hours of long questioning, he confessed to the murder of Carolyn Barney and 2 other women. The additional victims were listed as 24-year-old Loretta Perry, who was killed on January 25th, and Vivian Collins, a woman killed on March 18th. Both women had been raped and strangled to death, similarly to that of the death of Carolyn Barney. Now, during his interrogation, Louis claimed that Vivian Collins' murder was committed by his older brother, Roger, after he had paid her for sex. Now, according to his story, he claimed that his brother had strangled Vivian during the act of sex. According to relatives of Louis and Roger, an alibi was provided for Roger on the day of Vivian's murder. Now, the relatives that provided testimony included Louis's own mother. Since Louis's story could not be corroborated with testimony from his family members, Roger was never charged with the death of Vivian Collins. Subsequently, though, Louis was charged with murder, which now included 2 more additional murders. Not only was he accused of the murder of Carolyn Barney, Vivian Collins, and Loretta Perry, he was now suspected in the death of 24-year-old Gail Fricklin and 30-year-old Sheila Burton. Now, Sheila Burton, a woman of African descent, was found in a vacant lot strangled to death on November 18th of 1984. Gail Fricklin was also an African-American woman. She was found on August 15th of 1985. She was found strangled to death in an alley in Willowbrook. Like Lewis's other victims, their bodies were found not far from the home where Lewis's parents had resided. In total, Lewis was charged with 4 murders and highly suspected of committing a 5th. Lewis Craine's trial began in early 1989. The main material evidence presented at trial was a blood-stained t-shirt which had a matching blood group to one of the victims. Now, blood grouping is another term for blood type. In the late 1980s, DNA was still in its infancy, so it was not possible to get a detailed DNA profile. When compared to the science of today, you were very limited into what you could do with a DNA sample. Not only was there DNA, but we had testimony from several of Lewis Craine's relatives, including his own mother, who told the court that he had repeatedly expressed aggressive behavior towards women, many of which were prostitutes. There were also testimonies from those that had seen Lewis in a bloody t-shirt after one of the murders. Now, the most damning piece of evidence at his trial, that for me would be the hardest for his defense team to overcome, would be his confession of killing Loretta Perry. Initially, it was believed that she had died from a drug overdose, but after Lewis's testimony, her body was exhumed and subjected to a thorough pathological study, which resulted in the validation of Lewis's claims that he had murdered Loretta Perry. Over the course of the trial, Lewis insisted on his innocence. He refuted his own written testimony, stating that he had been pressured into confessing by police. Now, as far as this claim goes, in the late 1980s, and I'm assuming that, a cop may or may not rough up 1 or 2 perps during an investigation, it wasn't unheard of. He also stated that the bloody shirt, which according to his relatives he had committed the murder in, did not belong to him. He also accused his family of committing perjury. As for his lawyers, they insisted that on the base of various tests, that Lewis was suffering from intellectual disabilities, which is the start of where the controversy is in this case. They portrayed him as an illiterate man with a 4th grade education and an IQ of 69. They stated at trial that due to his disability, he had a tendency to make exaggerations, and that he had a high susceptibility to suggestion. This all boiled down to imply that he was not responsible for his actions. As a result, they requested a forensic psychiatrist examine their client. Unfortunately, their application was rejected. This is a side note, guys, and this is just my opinion. I'm not fully satisfied with this argument and did a little research of my own. Now, a 10-year-old has an IQ of 69. Many people who have an IQ of 69 have falsely confessed to crimes that they didn't commit. That is known. And I can say that that happens, every so often. But I don't think that that's what happened in this case. I know a lot of 10-year-olds, and they all understand that murder is wrong. So I don't believe his IQ makes him any less culpable of his crimes. Lewis Craine's trial was brought to conclusion on May 16th, 1989. He was found guilty of 4 murders and acquitted of the murder of Sheila Burton. On June 6th of that same year, the court handed down his sentence, and his sentence was death. After his conviction, Lewis was transferred to the San Quentin State Prison to serve his sentence. Due to health-related problems, he was then transferred to a prison hospital near the city of San Rafael, where he died on November 3rd of 1989 from complications of AIDS. Now that brings us to our next perpetrator, Ivan Hill. Ivanhill is responsible for at least 9 murders in various suburbs of Los Angeles between 1986 and 1994. Many of his victims' bodies were found along the east-west highway known as California State Route 60, which earned him the nickname the 60 Freeway Killer. Now out of the so-called Southside Slayers killings, he committed at least one of those, but investigators suspect that he may have committed many more. Now, Ivanhill was born on March 30th, 1961, in Los Angeles. Ivan, like many serial killers, grew up in an abusive household. His father was aggressive towards not just his wife, but his children. On Christmas Day in 1968, Ivanhill's father shot his mother in the face with a .22 caliber rifle and was sent to prison. Despite the serious injuries that Ivan's mother received, she was able to survive and later divorced Ivan's father. By the age of 10, Ivan was the primary caregiver of his siblings. During his school years, Ivan was involved in sports, being elected team captain of the school's football team. Many of his acquaintances from those years spoke very positively of him. In 1978, a year before graduation, Ivanhill became addicted to drugs. He lost the interest in all of his studies. Now, we know the loop of those trapped in drug addiction. Many of them suffer financial difficulties due to their addiction, and Ivan wasn't much different. Due to his addiction, he suffered several financial difficulties, leading him to a criminal lifestyle in 1979. In 1979, starting in January, Ivan, along with an accomplice, committed several robberies. On January 23rd, 17-year-old Ivan and 18-year-old Vincent Myers robbed a liquor store in Glendora. During the robbery, Vincent Myers killed one store employee and seriously wounded another. For that crime, Vincent Myers was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. Now, since Ivan was a minor at the time, he was found guilty of complicity and received a short sentence due to his cooperation with the investigation. During his detention at one of the state's juvenile facilities, Ivan graduated from high school and in the mid-1980s was paroled. After his release, Ivan spent a lot of time in the San Gabriel Valley, moving from residence to residence. Just as often as he changed residences, he changed jobs. He worked as a day laborer, storekeeper, and a forklift driver. By the late 1980s, Ivan was rearrested for theft and convicted again. He was released in February of 1993. He would be rearrested again that following year, this time being sentenced to 10 years. Now, in 1994, Congress passed the DNA Identification Act, which authorized the FBI to create a national database containing DNA profiles of convicted offenders, as well as a separate database for missing persons. All forensic samples collected from crime scenes were to be uploaded to the database where they could be compiled and examined side by side. Now, while serving his sentence in 1994, Lewis was required to give a DNA sample, which was entered into the DNA database. Several years down the road, after giving that DNA sample, in March of 2003, just 1 year short of his release date, Ivan's DNA popped up at the scene of a murder. In 2003, DNA tests showed his profile corresponded to that of an unidentified serial killer. This killer had left DNA evidence during several attacks on women in different suburbs of Los Angeles. This killer was active from November of 1993 to January of 1994, and previously was active in February of 1986 to 1987. Conveniently, Ivanhill had been out of prison during both sets of attacks. The first death attributed to Ivan would be that of Lorna Patricia Reed. On February 11, 1986, the body of Lorna Reed, then 35, was found strangled in an isolated area of Frank G. Bonelli Regional Park. Lorna at the time was active as a prostitute. She was believed to be the 16th victim in a similar string of murders. His second victim was Rhonda Jackson. On January 26, 1987, Rhonda Jackson's nude body was found strangled in a dumpster in Palomares Park in Pomona. Ivan's third victim, and this one has a really sad story, guys, would be that of Betty Sue Harris. On November 1st of 1993, 37-year-old Betty Harris was found manually strangled to death behind an industrial building in Diamond Bar. Now, Betty Sue was a former student of Chaffey College and grew up in Pomona. Before her death, she had been diagnosed with cancer, and after a short stint in jail for petty crimes, she had resolved to spend the rest of what time she had left being a good mother. Unfortunately, her life was cut short. Rhonda Brooks Bates was to be Ivan's next victim. On November 5th of 1993, 31-year-old Rhonda Bates, also known as Roxanne Brown, was found strangled in Chino. She was a prostitute in the Los Angeles area and was convicted twice for prostitution in 1991, and twice more the year she was found murdered. She was found in similar circumstances as his other victims. On November 14th of 1993, the body of Helen Hill, Ivan's newest victim, was found. Also known as Helen Rudd, she was found dumped in an industrial complex parking lot in the city of Industry. At the time of her death, she was 36 years old. She was found with her hands bound behind her back and her mouth taped shut. During the autopsy, it was determined that she had been strangled with 2 cloths. As the investigation proceeded, they found out that she was on probation for drug violations at the time of her murder. Her roommate described her as a devoted mother and caretaker to her elderly mother. Ivan's reign of terror didn't stop there. On November 16th of 1993, Donna Goldsmith, a 35-year-old living in West Covina, was found strangled in an industrial area of Pomona. A strip of duct tape with a lipstick stain was found in a trash bin near her body. It was determined that her killer had strangled her with a piece of rope, shoelaces, and a piece of black fabric. Donna was a wife and mother to 3 children. Before her descent into a downward spiral of addiction and petty crime, she had worked as a medical technician before her addiction took hold. She had been arrested earlier that year for shoplifting just a few blocks from where her body was found. On December 30th of 1993, Cheryl Sayers, 34, was found strangled in a park in Pomona. She, like many of the other victims, was found bound and strangled to death. The final murder would be that of 33-year-old Deborah Denise Brown. On January 12th of 1994, in San Antonio Park, Deborah was found strangled to death. She had been strangled with a piece of blue fabric, which was still wrapped around her neck. Research suggests that Deborah had a history of prostitution, but I was not able to establish if this was true. When we left off with Ivan, he was sitting in jail for robbery. Now he's suspected of murder, and not just one, but a series. On October 23rd of 2006, the trial of Ivanhill began. On the first day of the trial, gruesome images of the victims were presented on a giant screen, causing women in the courtroom to run out. Voice recordings of phone calls made by Ivanhill taunting the police were played. On one of the calls, Ivanhill said, "I did it again." This statement was immediately following the death of Deborah Brown. Another clip said, "What's this? Number 5, number 6? I forget, but she's there." Minutes later, he called back, taunting, "Y'all better catch me before I kill again." On November 17th of 2006, Ivanhill was convicted of 6 counts of murder. During the sentencing phase of the trial, Ivanhill's mother testified. She had hopes for leniency in Ivan's case, as she gave details regarding the physical and mental abuse that he had suffered at the hands of his father. Despite her efforts, on January 2nd of 2007, a jury ordered the death penalty in Ivan's case. On May 15th of 2009, Ivan pled guilty to 2 other murders, that of Lorna Reed and Rhonda Jackson. As of January 2023, the 61-year-old Ivanhill is still alive and waiting execution in San Quentin State Prison's death row. Okay, guys, I feel like this is a strong start to the podcast amidst a bunch of changes, and I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I know some of you enjoy the bickering of John and I, but I hope that you enjoyed this as well. I am hoping to do an episode very soon with a guest star, but for now, this is how we'll be doing things. Thank you guys so much for joining in and listening to today's episode. Have a good one, guys, and check back with me next week for another riveting episode of Page 3 Killers, Murders That Went Unnoticed. Bye, guys.